Hello and welcome to the Data Engineering Podcast, the show about modern data management. When you're ready to build your next pipeline or want to test out the projects you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so check out our friends at Linode. With their new managed database service, you can launch a production-ready MySQL, Postgres, or MongoDB cluster in minutes, with automated backups, 40 gigabit connections from your application hosts, and high-throughput SSDs. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/Linode today and get a $100 credit to launch a database, create a Kubernetes cluster, or take advantage of all of their other services. And don't forget to thank them for their continued support of this show. Data stacks are becoming more and more complex. This brings infinite possibilities for data pipelines to break and a host of other issues, severely deteriorating the quality of the data and causing teams to lose trust. Siflay solves this problem by acting as an overseeing layer to the data stack, observing data and ensuring it's reliable from ingestion all the way to consumption. Whether the data is in transit or at rest, Siflay can detect data quality anomalies, assess business impact, identify the root cause, and alert data teams on their preferred channels. All thanks to over 50 quality checks, extensive column-level lineage, and over 20 connectors across the data stack. In addition, data discovery is made easy through Siflay's information-rich data catalog with a powerful search engine and real-time health status. Listeners of the podcast will get $2,000 to use as platform credits when signing up to use Siflay. Siflay also offers a 2-week free trial. Find out more at dataengineeringpodcast.com/Siflay today. That's SIFFLET.
Your host is Tobias Macey, and today I'm interviewing Lindsay Pettingill, Chetan Sharma, Swaroop Jagadish, Maxime Beauchemin, and Nick Handel about the lessons that they learned in their time at Airbnb and how they're carrying that forward to their respective companies. So, Lindsay, can you start by introducing yourself?
Sure. My name's Lindsay Pettingill, CEO and founder of a company called Iggy. I was at Airbnb for 5 years as a data scientist and started Iggy a little over 2 years ago, where we focus on helping companies build great products with location geospatial data.
And Che, how about yourself?
Yeah, I'm Che Sharma. I'm the CEO of EPO. We're an experimentation framework that's built for the modern data stack.
And Swaroop?
Hey, I'm co-founder and CTO at Acryl Data. We are driving the open source data hub project, the larger ecosystem around data governance and data observability and so on. Before this, I used to lead data platform and search infrastructure at Airbnb.
And Max?
Hey, I'm Max. I'm CEO and founder at a company called Preset. We're commercializing Apache Superset, which is a project that I started, an open source project I started while I was at Airbnb in 2015, I believe. I worked with these fine folks here on the call today back then, and also started Apache Airflow back then. So that was back in 2014.
And Nick?
Hey, I'm Nick. Sorry, a bit of a cold, but I'm CEO, co-founder. I spent about 4 years at Airbnb, 2014 to 2018, so overlapped with this fine group as a data scientist and then a product manager on data tools. And Transform is a metric store that enables teams to define metrics and consume them consistently across a variety of data tools.
And going back to the beginning, Lindsay, do you remember how you first got introduced to working in data?
Oh, man, for sure. Yeah, I was just reflecting on this. Back in 2003, I did an internship at Deutsche Bank in Frankfurt, and they had bought a number of, or merged with some Italian banks. And I was on a team that was responsible for essentially merging in a bunch of employee level data. And there was a big learning curve. Let's just say that. The only tool I had at my disposal was Excel. But that's really where my journey started. As soon as I started working on that project, I was just, fascinated by data and picked up a lot of skills thereafter. But that was where I got my first taste.
And Che, do you remember how you got started in data?
Yeah, absolutely. I studied engineering and stats undergrad and master's, and then I worked in healthcare policy for a little bit of time, but most of my formative career was at Airbnb with these folks. So that was where I got to do things like machine learning and setting up a bunch of analytics infra and, building all sorts of data tools.
Swaroop, how did you get started in data?
It was a while ago, but I was involved in writing data pipelines for handling all the search advertising data at Yahoo back in the day when Yahoo was still good at search. Joining large amounts of search and click events and enabling fraud detection and those types of use cases on top of all this massive amounts of data. Back when Hadoop didn't exist and that we built a system that was a precursor for Hadoop. Then I went on to build a source of truth database at LinkedIn. Then did the foundation for data at Airbnb back when data culture was still being formed. That's been my journey.
So I didn't know you wrote data pipelines at any point. I think you've been good at hiding that from all of us.
Yeah. Yes.
If you let anyone know that you've built data pipelines before, they're like, there you go. Now go build more. Go fix the pipelines. Go be a plumber. But yeah, I also was at Yahoo at some point, but I go further back than that. So I started a company called Ubisoft, video game company, and then they were building their first data warehouse in about like 2000, 2001. And that made me a data warehouse architect and a business intelligence engineer. The stack was the Microsoft like BI stack at the time. So Microsoft SQL Server 2000 and a little bit of Hyper and S-Base analysis services. So kind of first gen BI. And then joined Yahoo, where was the birth of Hadoop. So a little bit later, maybe after Swaroop, 2007-8 was when like the Hadoop story was starting to come together. The pre-Hadoop world is even worse than Hadoop, if you can imagine that. There's something called Mina, and then these really bad distributed like data lake databases that were.
Mina is what I worked on.
Yeah, it was like practically unqueryable. And we're using Perl at the time. And then we went to Facebook, where I think like for me, that's where my career really started. Like Facebook 2012, like really a golden era. I think a really fun place to be, and where a lot of like what we see in the modern data stack today, kind of like some of these ideas were already kind of bubbling internally there at Facebook back then.
Yeah, distributed Perl just sounds like a foot gun that points both ways. And Nick, how did you get started in data?
Didn't really know exactly what I wanted to do, start my career, but I studied math. And so I went into macroeconomic research, joined BlackRock, and spent a few years there before I moved over to Airbnb. It was kind of interesting because I feel like I got like 3 generations of data stacks in kind of very rapid succession, going from BlackRock to Airbnb, and then kind of now working in this modern data stack world. But yeah, Airbnb was really when my kind of career formed. And originally I was a data scientist, then moved over to product, working on data tools.
And so, as you've each mentioned, you all had some overlap in your time at Airbnb and have then gone on to found your own respective companies. And I'm wondering whether you think the fact that you went from Airbnb into launching, new businesses and focusing on your respective areas of the data ecosystem, is that an outgrowth of the fact that there was a good amount of kind of data-oriented culture and work environment and curiosity that you wanted to explore further? Or was it more an outgrowth of the fact that you felt a particular pain in your time at Airbnb and you wanted to be able to solve it for other people?
My situation was like very, very simple, right? I started 2 open source projects, and the VCs were like, oh, these projects are really taken off, and then commercial open source companies are successful. So they kind of summed it all up and were like, dude, would you like to start a company? I was like, I don't think so. But then, spoke with a set of founders at the time and got convinced that it was the right thing to do. So it's really, for me, it was like the open source traction that was the kicker.
I think in general, there's just a lot more data tools companies out there. The ecosystem has really blossomed, and the bunch of secular trends that have led to it. So I think there's part of a timing is that just, we all left Airbnb sometime 2017, 2018, and the moment was ripe. I think there was also something to Airbnb itself, which is, we really, prized entrepreneurialism. I think Brian Chesky for a while only hired ex-founders as PMs for, kind of talk about how far that went. And the other thing is that I think from a data standpoint, Airbnb just had a lot in common with a lot of the companies that were going to kind of end up being big data consumers, in that we had different types of data. So we had event streams, which is, the type of thing that Facebook's were really built on. And then we also had transactional tables that were the root of a lot of DAGs. And so, we had purchases as the main backbone of metrics, which is a lot of ways other companies are operating. And so I think the kind of entrepreneurial culture, the nature of the data, and just the timing kind of led to a lot of people going to entrepreneurship. But I'm curious if you all agree with that same take.
Yeah, in that case, I think the couple of factors. One is seeing how quickly things got done at Airbnb for the most important problems and delivering that business value. seeing how it can be replicated outside of Airbnb. But I was also kind of the last person standing at Airbnb after all these folks left. So I saw a bunch of things that didn't necessarily go well at Airbnb too, specifically when they tried going public and after COVID hit. So in terms of the weak spots, essentially saw that data practitioners were having to deal with all kinds of questions related to SOX compliance, IPO readiness, worrying about cloud cost efficiency, and these types of things. I saw clear opportunity where practitioners should not be dealing with these types of questions. And in spite of all the great progress we've made, there's still a lot to be done in this space. That's the reason I got started.
We reacted to that in different ways. For me, I was like, oh, all the IPO stuff and the compliance stuff is coming. I got to get out of here.
Yeah.
And then Bart was like, oh, there's probably a business idea and all this SOC 2 and compliance stuff.
Yeah.
I think at the core, I think there are 90 something founders that came out of Airbnb. And that's just like the number of, somebody who aggregated a list like a year ago. So it's probably more at this point. So I think at the core, it was a very entrepreneurial company. I think the thing for me was that I went to a startup after Airbnb. And I think one of the things I saw was that Airbnb's data stack was actually very similar to the way that the kind of modern data stack works today. But obviously like a whole different set of tools, a ton of stuff built in-house. But just the way that the company was working, I think was actually pretty similar to the way that the modern data stack works today. And so in some ways, I think it felt a little more natural for some of us as we transitioned to trying to start companies in kind of the broader ecosystem.
Yeah, another piece, I'm curious if you've seen the same things, but in retrospect, Airbnb was pretty successful at centralizing a lot of data workflows. When I now look at these much larger companies, even if they have investments in things like experimentation, it's like every team's got their own thing. We had a little bit of that with machine learning, which is pretty hard to centralize at Airbnb. But in terms of analytics workflows, I think we did a pretty good job of getting people on a centralized, vetted, kind of governed set of systems. And, ultimately that's what you need to do a data tools company is like generalizability.
I think it's interesting that you call out the kind of separation of the analytics and the ML workflows, because another company that has spawned a lot of different companies and businesses out of it is Uber, which a lot of those have been focused more on the ML side of the house, which is obviously a very kind of core competency that they invested a lot of time and energy in. And I'm wondering how you view some of the kind of outgrowth of some of these large tech organizations and how they impact the broader ecosystem around them, both because of the work that they do internally and share through various sort of blogs and conferences, but also through the people that learn and then leave those companies and start new ventures such as yourselves. And a lot of you are very kind of analytics oriented, just how that kind of core company culture then creates those kind of ripples throughout the ecosystem.
This is something I've definitely noticed is that each alumni kind of has their set of, values and baggage. Like in particular, Uber is an interesting case because, for the experimentation thing, they weren't able to really centralize metric definitions for a long time, which was a core part of how the Airbnb system was built. And so, they ended up with a bring your own metric system and experimentation where it just kind of embraced that everyone's going to define things slightly differently, which is like anathema to how kind of Airbnb operates. And, from Facebook, I've noticed everyone kind of people love scuba. That system seems like it really was, they're like, why can't I have scuba everywhere? And I don't know if that other alumni have as much appreciation for that type of tool.
I think people get the opportunity to have these fast growing company to rebuild something from scratch that they might have seen at a previous company, right? So maybe you come from LinkedIn and you saw some little project that was done kind of well, but not perfectly. And you're like, okay, now we're going to need something like this here. And I get to rebuild it. So that was a little bit part of my story. Something interesting about the Airbnb and Uber relationship. I remember many of us went to share with Uber and they would never come to us because I think of NDAs or I don't know, there was some legal restriction where it was generally the Airbnb folks that would go to Uber to have sharing session, and that it was really often unidirectional, and we'd come back and be like, yeah, that's weird. They asked me a bunch of questions and took notes and spun me around and sent me back home. I don't know. That was my impression. Very, very different cultures between the two companies, but I guess in both cases, there's a lot of similarities too, right? In terms of building a lot of stuff from scratch, an engineering-driven culture, strong at data. I think fundamentally to Uber was just more real time, so much more real time than Airbnb, and much more like inference in real time too. So a lot of like ML systems that need to be like real time. So that maybe defined like a lot where they invested and the kind of companies that came out of there.
In my case, I've seen this happen at two companies so far, like LinkedIn, obviously, Kafka and Confluent and Apache Pinot and Startree. There's a rich history there. Same thing happened at Airbnb. There's a certain amount of fearlessness that you need when you take on big, hairy problems. And there seems to be funding and fearlessness for these types of things in these companies because it's so kind of tied to business outcomes. Sometimes you can take it too far and start to say this is how the entire industry needs to solve all problems. That may or may not be the case every time. So we just have to balance our, kind of fearlessness in tackling some of these problems with what the mainstream needs sometimes. I would say that's the only counterbalance we need.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something worth building on. The idea that sort of two things there, where one is because you're working at these large organizations where you're running into problems that other people aren't liable to encounter because of the scale and the fact that because it's a large company, you have the available engineering expertise and the resources to invest in doing these research projects and figuring out how do we solve these problems using engineering. That's a way to actually acquire the necessary lessons to then go on and be able to say, okay, now I'm going to start over because I already know all the things I need to know that I didn't know when I started the other project, so I can do it differently now. But then also the potential for maybe over-engineering things where you say, that's how I had to do it at LinkedIn, at Airbnb, at Uber, whatever it is. And so now I'm going to go and build that for everybody, but I'm building it with the experience that I had at that large organization. So I don't necessarily know how well that maps to, these small startups or companies that aren't necessarily purely software and tech oriented. And just curious what some of the experiences that you've all had as founders going into that space have been of, I learned this lesson the hard way. Now I'm going to, save everybody else that pain, but then realizing that they're not encountering the pain the same way that you did because of their different circumstances.
Yeah, I think one thing you can tell from this crowd is a lot of us did multiple rodeos here. And so, you saw the kind of end of the book, and then you also went to other startups and started from the beginning again. And I think that kind of breeds a certain empathy for people at different stages of maturity. For me, it was very telling to go from Airbnb to these kind of Series A, Series B startups with like one or two data people trying to bootstrap like very complex workflows off the shelf tools and limited headcount.
Yeah, I would say that there's definitely a big challenge around kind of generalizing, even if you've gone to a few companies, like trying to understand more generally what the problems are that the market faces. It's a huge challenge, right? It's like you can't go to enough companies, you can't work at enough companies to get enough perspective. And so I think that there's the generalization piece, but there's also just the kind of shift of building tools inside of a company and building tools in a kind of competitive market, right? Where there's a lot of dynamics that you have to be able to respond to. That's probably some of the biggest lessons that I've learned.
There's a huge difference for me, between like building an internal tool, right? Like then you just like talk to your neighbors and it's like people are very accessible and like you see what they're doing on the product you're building live, right? They're sitting next to you and the feedback loops are super tight. And then there's like the generalization issue and the quality issues of when you actually sell your product to a broad set of people and needs to be tight and solid and high quality and tested, and it needs to work for everyone. I think it's a lot harder to build in that context. It's a lot slower. It's not necessarily harder. It takes more resources to make a step forward where you're carrying, 100 customers on your shoulders than if it's just like your buddies that are sitting next to you and you're approving each other's pull requests.
I was having some technical challenges to share in that. I think one of the differences like between me and some other folks here, I built something that didn't exist at Airbnb, right? Like it hadn't been built. Me and my team are still trying to will it into being. And I think one of the challenges that is both associated with that and associated with being at a company like Airbnb, where, all of us worked on and built data tools, but the ends of them were very product focused, for the most part. And one thing that I have been routinely shocked by, and it's no longer shocking, but it's kind of slow to accept some of the lessons that you encounter as a founder, is the way that I thought about data, the way that our data science team, our data analytics team thought about data, thought about leveraging data, thought about leveraging tools for data is not that common, not like normally distributed amongst companies. And so like it was a blessing, an incredible blessing to like be a part of this team, and take those lessons to build a company. However, it's like so challenging when you realize that like we joke at Iggy that like sometimes our customers aren't as creative as we expect them to be, because we sometimes take for granted, what it's like to be in an environment like Airbnb where, again, leveraging data and tools to improve the product was like such a part of our being. So
on that vein of kind of the culture being an important element of the ways that you're able to take advantage of data, I'm wondering what were the elements of the data culture at Airbnb that were done right and that were invested in appropriately? And what were some of the critical decisions and inflection points in the company's growth and their journey of how they collected and took advantage of data that led you down that path?
A few things I'd like to talk about that are like kind of unique to Airbnb. Well, not unique, but like there was a huge investment in data. Like they built a data team from scratch, and it went from like a handful of people to like more than 100 people very quickly. So they invested in data infrastructure and data science and across the board, like data engineering. So very heavy investment and a lot of freedom around like building custom things. Not every company can afford that too. So, we were in that place of super high growth. But one thing I think that was interesting coming from Facebook and Yahoo and places like that is that the data science team was largely like brand new. I guess there was no like 100 data scientists you could hire at the time. So the strategy was to make them, right? So we're like, we're going to make our own data people. And we hired probably out of the 100 data scientists that were there around that time, many were like PhD, fresh out of school, super smart, but also like not classically trained in data, which brought both like a new set of eyes and new set of approaches, kind of fresh take on things. And then, which is a really positive thing, but so maybe that allowed us to challenge the establishment and do things in a new way. But I think one thing we did really well that I think I haven't seen done as well in many places is the education component and the data university. So there's a blog post on it, but there was like definitely investment around teaching the data structures, the internal like data sets and the data tools to everyone internally, like teaching SQL to anyone who's interested to learn SQL, putting tools in front of them, data 101. I forgot what all the classes were, but they were like SQL 101, data 101. I remember teaching like Airflow and superset classes, weekly. There was just kind of this conveyor belt of like training everyone, pushing data literacy up in the organization, which was like super great.
The company had very clear goals in terms of business goals and how it was growing. And even though the leadership was famously design-led, the next layer was actually very, very data literate. I remember folks like, Joe Bott, and there's just few names that only the Airbnb folks will recognize. But the next layer of leadership were very data literate. And, there were some strong product managers. There were some strong, data scientists. They had the lead for all of data science was really influential in terms of, influencing the executive team. So all that played a big role. And then there were a few key data products like search and pricing. Those were inherently the magnets for, strong experimentation, strong metrics-driven analysis, and bringing the best machine learning folks. Some centers of excellence started to emerge. And very quickly, because of people coming from mature organizations, there was this focus on creating core data, which is meant to power all of these different outcomes. So I haven't seen so many mistakes being made at Airbnb compared to what I've seen in other organizations when you lay the foundations, because a bunch of us had seen it before and we didn't allow for the same types of mistakes to happen. But it doesn't mean that we didn't get something's wrong. I'll get to that in a minute. But I think we kind of benefited from a lot of good things happening in a very compressed time period at a time when growth was like skyrocketing at Airbnb.
Yeah, completely. I feel like there's a huge org strategy element here. And I can go a little bit further back to before we made the big investment, because that wasn't always the case. And With the first 5 to 10 data scientists back when there wasn't as much leadership investment in data, everyone was very good at communicating, like very good at, taking complex topics with really unsound foundations and still driving impact with them. And that really led to a lot of buy-in and seeing data teams as like a stakeholder that deserved to be like early in the strategic process rather than this sort of like lagging, get me a dashboard type of function. Once we start seeing a lot of success, such as on the search ranking team, running these experiments or, kind of early supply growth liquidity stuff, that kind of opened the floodgates to say, like, we need data as like, it's no longer just a triad of like engineering, design, product. Now it's going to be a quartet at every level of org, that we're now going to have leaders like a head of growth data, head of marketplace data. That kind of let every team build it into their DNA that they're going to have this very data-centric philosophy. And then the other thing we did, which I also don't see as much, is that despite being very, very embedded, we still were a force of centralization of these capabilities. Again, like you mentioned, core data. We all decided we have this common metric definition. We're going to have a common experiment infra and reporting method. We're going to have a general set of governance for data pipeline building and management that, eventually turns into something like a metric layer. I usually see a lot of teams either not embed at all and end up with just kind of like an R&D ML focus, or they get fully fragmented, but they never make these centralized investments.
I agree on that, like the good balance between the two, right? The balance between the vertical pool and the horizontal pool, the sharing. Like one thing too that was unique, I thought, from other companies I was at is like the culture of consensus. That drove me crazy at the time because like everyone's feelings had to be in check all the time and everyone had to agree. Like there was like this deep consensus culture, but I think it did create a place where everyone communicated, everyone was on board. The cost of that was a lot of time in meetings, like hashing details.
I was one of those data scientists that Max mentioned that was hired first real job out of grad school. So I did a PhD in political science. I used Stata and a little bit of R, no Python experience. I had barely written a SQL query. And, one response to that could be like, well, how could you possibly be hired as a data scientist, right? The other response is, well, these are just tools that you can learn, right? And I mention that because I remember when I joined, Airbnb had this CEO dashboard, and it wasn't just weekly metrics, it was queries behind the metrics. And I learned SQL by, looking at those queries and trying to recreate them. And, one thing that hasn't been mentioned is data repo, right? Or knowledge repo, excuse me, at Airbnb was always one of my favorite tools. And one of the reasons why is that it just exemplified to me this curiosity sharing driven approach to our product and data, whereby knowledge repo, you would commit code and sort of tell a narrative, back to Shay's point about communication. And it was an incredible way to share what you were working on, but in a very lightweight way, get feedback from folks. And I don't know, it was just it just really exemplifies to me this attitude we had around the dissemination and sharing of knowledge that, I don't know if they're still using it, but someone who was new to tech and new to sort of data at the scale that we had at Airbnb, it was an indispensable tool that really welcomed me and so many other people to, different ways of thinking and doing data work.
I think one of the things that I think the data team did really well to get buy-in from the rest of the organization was build tools that got them more involved. And I think a lot of it happened really in 2014. And Jay, I'm actually curious because you saw the before of this and I kind of came in right in the middle. But February of 2014-ish was core data, which was, hey, we've got tons of messy data sets everywhere. Let's make a core set of data sets that anyone who can learn SQL can then go query. And that kind of led to this SQL education program called School, SQOOL, which I always thought was clever. And then I think it was around July or August was ERF. People were building experiments, but this was this experiment reporting framework that allowed you to define metrics and kind of automated the data pipelines. And that led to Minerva and a bunch of the stuff that Airbnb talks about now, which I think really kind of lends itself well to data accessibility and just getting lots and lots of people involved in the data. And then I think the next big one was Airflow. And Max, you know the date better than I do, but like, I don't know, October, November of 2014-ish, right?
14, yeah, right around that time.
Yeah. And like that took what was, I think, mostly a data engineering job at that point of kind of going and building a bunch of tables. And data scientists got involved every once in a while.
Yeah.
And like Lindsay, we would write cron jobs or something before that, but it was such a mess. And they would Kronos, that's right. And they would fail all the time and nothing would ever work. And then Airflow basically brought in this entire group of people into that kind of data construction process. And so I think between those, you had data scientists going and building better, cleaner tables for consumption. And then you had good, clean metrics and experimentation interface that, I mean, everyone on the product team, like when the product team was 1,000 people, like everyone would go and look at that interface. And so I think it was just really, really getting, the kind of product managers, the designers, the engineers, like, the ops teams, like getting everyone involved in the data that kind of justified more and more buy-in that led to more and more better tools.
Experimentation is super, super key there. Like I saw the transformation from not being experimentation driven. I think when I first joined, there was like maybe 60 things in ERF that didn't work. Basically the experimentation framework and where we did A/B tests. And then we kind of unplugged that drain. And over that period, like 2015, over 2015, we became like super experimentation driven, which completely shift how you approach product development, or not all product development, but like product iteration. And that became really central to like really core to a lot of the data work and like justifying all this investment in data to all of a sudden we could like prove, how we're impacting product and engagement and growth.
So we talked about a few of the trends that kind of came together there. What's kind of interesting you bringing up to today is that like now people have Airflow and they got dbt and they have these like super elastic warehouses. So a bunch of those things that held us back from, laying solid foundations are now just completely solved. But one of the things that came out of these investments in experimentation, which is kind of part of why I was excited to start a company in it, is that like experimentation starts to get you down this path of good database modeling. And I think through a lot of what Core Data did was say, like, let's take a lot of these concepts and make them like, atomic facts that can be aggregated in various ways. Let's have some kind of governance model around dimensions and say, like, what are we going to split by? And when you look at a lot of these companies out there, like, I don't think they put as much effort into kind of extensible, reusable database modeling in the way that Core Data effort did, and that ultimately led to all sorts of things blossoming.
I see some of it.
Yeah.
I think sometimes, yeah. And maybe less and less. This is my point about how Airbnb's data ecosystem was not that different.
Yeah.
Like one of the main differences was that we just built a bunch of tools internally, but they actually closely resemble, or in the case of Airflow, like is a tool that everyone else uses, right? And so I think that that's part of the reason why, when we all went out and started looking at starting companies, we could just look around and see the ecosystem and it was familiar, right? It wasn't like we were in a totally different world. And I think that a lot of big companies exist in a totally different world than the rest of the ecosystem.
Yeah, I think that's definitely worth highlighting where, to your point, a lot of folks who I talk to who come from Google, they say, oh, at Google, everything was amazing. And then I came out of Google and now I have to rebuild all the whole stack that I was used to at Google before I could get anything else done. Similar stories at places like Facebook, where after a certain point, the world that you're in is so far divorced from the world that everybody else has to deal with that you can't work in the same way. So when you do go on to a different company or try to start a new business, you're trying to solve problems in a way that nobody else can recognize. And so it adds an extra friction. So for all of you coming from Airbnb, to your point, that it already resembled the way that everybody else was progressing to as far as how they address data. So there wasn't that massive culture shock or the massive kind of relearning of how to do things that you had to undergo before you could start building on top of it.
One idea I'm trying to push recently is, or not idea, but there's like this idea of data native companies, right? So nowadays you start a company. So like the companies we all started here, and we all started, the day of our launch, or even before that, when we launched our beta product, we already had, really good analytics, at least like in our case, we had a data warehouse, we had good metrics and dimension, we're logging everything. short of like experimentation, we're doing a lot of the things that Airbnb did at the time, which is kind of fantastic, right? Airbnb was not a data native company. It had to like use like blood, sweat, and tears to like, build the infrastructure that we needed to be data driven. But now that stuff is so accessible, right? It's cheap. I can sign you up for BigQuery, Fivetran, dbt Cloud, Preset, and all of each other's like lovely companies we have here, and then get started and have like a stack that is comparable in terms of what you can accomplish, to Airbnb's data stack, which is amazing. That's huge progress. And now what do people do now? I don't know. They need to go and invent other things or like be really good at using these tools as opposed to like making the tools.
Yeah. Now everybody spends their time integrating all those different tools and the layers and trying to turn the modern data stack back into a vertical solution.
Complain about what's wrong about Airflow,
Yes.
and why GPT is not perfect.
Plenty of that going around.
That's like mostly what I feel like the data team at Airbnb ended up doing anyways, right? Like we had all these different tools figuring out how to stitch them all together.
Data teams are increasingly under pressure to deliver. According to a recent survey by Ascend.io, 95% reported being at or over capacity, with 72% of data experts reporting demands on their team going up faster than they can hire. It's no surprise they are increasingly turning to automation. In fact, while only 3.5% report having current investments in automation, 85% of data teams plan on investing in automation in the next 12 months. That's where our friends at Ascend.io come in. The Ascend Data Automation Cloud provides a unified platform for data ingestion, transformation, orchestration, and observability. Ascend users love its declarative pipelines, powerful SDK, elegant UI, and extensible plugin architecture, as well as its support for Python, SQL, Scala, and Java. Ascend automates workloads on Snowflake, Databricks, BigQuery, and open source Spark, and can be deployed in AWS, Azure, or GCP. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/ascend and sign up for a free trial. If you're a Data Engineering Podcast listener, you get credits worth $5,000 when you become a customer.
And one of the most informative lessons that anybody can learn is when they start making mistakes. And there are all these things that have gone right at Airbnb that have, given you each the lessons that you're building on top of and the tools that you're building in your own companies. But what were some of the mistakes or dead ends that you each made, either individually or collectively, that were most instructive for you that you carry forward into the work that you're doing today?
I want to kind of call out maybe 2 or 3 things in terms of what I saw were not necessarily great things at Airbnb in terms of how we did data. One was as the company scaled and we went from a simple business to multiple business units and so on, our foundations didn't really hold up as well. And, people talk about decentralization and business units owning their data. We started to experience some of that early, and I don't think we navigated that really well. We talked about core data earlier. That kind of started creaking at the edges once business units started forming. We were forced to actually push some parts of the foundational data sets into business units because that's where the funding came from for data engineers. And you see that happening in the industry today. Like the funding for analyst headcount, the funding for data engineers comes closer to line of business, not so much the central teams. The central teams are very lean now. And we didn't quite navigate that piece really well. What we should have probably done is lay out standards and frameworks which allows the line of business folks to own data sets according to governed standards. People talk about data mesh and all these things these days. To me, it's all very buzzwordy, but the bottom line is I think as an industry, we're still struggling with that problem, and we had that problem. That was one. And I saw an unnecessary forking of analytics and machine learning at Airbnb. The metrics standardization effort mostly powered analytics and experimentation, and the ML folks went off and did their own feature repository, and there was like a reinvention happening at every layer there. Nick is smiling away here, but
I got some thoughts on this one.
Yeah. Some of it was necessary. Don't get me wrong. We had to do what we had to do for realizing the impact.
I don't think it was necessary.
Well,
it's just when you have a legacy system and somebody's telling you to build, a new thing for ML, people don't want to change, merge ideas.
Yeah, I think strong first principles thinking on the ML side was missing. We were stronger on the analytics side. And I would say finally, there was a come to Jesus moment when IPO happened in terms of the amount of panic that set in due to poor data quality for all the top metrics that were being closely monitored, and felt like we had somehow completely missed a trick there. So in terms of making sure data quality standards are being enforced right from, we got to a much better state eventually, but there was a lot of push and there was a lot of blood, sweat, and tears drop. So those three things stand out to me in terms of where we clearly missed a trick.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest problem that Airbnb had around machine learning was that there were three core applications that were just absolutely critical to the company's success. There was pricing, search, and then there was kind of trust and safety applications of ML. And that business couldn't succeed without those applications being built out early. And there was no centralization of the way that those different teams built their infrastructure. And so they built huge amounts of infrastructure and grew to be like 10, 15 person teams each supporting their own infrastructure. And then the organization said, you know what? We have a fourth application for ML. And it's not just a fourth, we've got 100 fourth applications for ML. And we need to build centralized infrastructure for all of those other ones. But at the same time, there was not buy-in from all of the three main applications to merge onto centralized infrastructure. And so you kind of just ended up with a fourth version of ML infrastructure within the company. And then related to the feature store, metric store thing is really interesting. They are very different. And you probably could have merged a lot of ideas between them. There are different requirements for each of those systems. And we didn't end up merging them because our metrics applications at that point, that was 2018 and the metrics application started in 2014. And so we were 4 years down this path, and trying to merge those things was just impossible at that point.
That's a really good question though. Should the feature store, the metric store kind of be built off of the same, have a lot of shared parts is a really interesting question that is unrelated to the discussion here. But
yeah, you should have heard my pitch for Transform in 2019. I tried this idea of this derived data repository. And I think that I'm actually, glad that I didn't work on that, because I think that that is such a broad set of requirements that I don't know that you could really build that as a commercially viable piece of software.
Yeah. Fundamentally, also data scientists won't agree. I don't care about the same thing as the BI world, data science world. Maybe need to be independent. They're a different set of people who care about different things and have different.
Honestly, I think it's the VC dollars which are forcing people to pick hyper specialized problems, whereas a little bit more leeway, a little bit more runway can actually allow us to build more generalized solutions. I think it may not be in the way these things are computed. I think those can certainly be different for ML and analytics applications, but there are lots of common things that unfortunately have to be repeated, like how you handle PII data, how you handle governance, all of this is fully repeated in all these stacks. So personas may be different, but the need for good data modeling and the need for traceability is something that I hear from ML practitioners also, because a lot of the data quality problems that they experience ends up being due to some external data set that the company is buying, not necessarily in how the features are being authored. So I do think there's a case for some consolidation there.
Yeah, I'll talk about some of the problems from Airbnb, and they're just they're related to the approach we had. So they're kind of flip side of a coin of decentralizing and democratizing access to data and access to tools, right? So by building things like Airflow and Superset and ERF, the experimentation framework, we allowed hundreds of people internally to go and write data pipelines, create visualization, create dashboards, create experiments. That's super empowering, but that leads to a lot of chaos and garbage. If it's really easy to do something, then you do it. And it leaves a lot of, call them data assets, that are not super well managed. So if you're going to enable people to do this, you need to have an equal effort, or at least an effort that's going to catch up in terms of garbage collection, figuring out what's not being used, and actively deleting and kind of decreating these assets. So we have this data graph that's growing. Then the leaves of these data graphs are unused, but everything else inside the data graph looks like it's used because it's used by things that are unused. So we worked a little bit on that problem at Facebook, which was like trying to figure out what's on the edge of the data graph and actively deleting these things, like sending email to people automatically. And if you don't click this button, your asset will be destroyed. Or here's a PR deleting the thing that you created that doesn't seem to be used. And that's a challenging problem. What happens with that is, as you get down this road, you have like hundreds of thousands of tables that you don't know what they're at, where they're coming from, or who created them and why. And you just end up with like more crap than actual like sanity in your data graph. I think that's a problem that's common to large companies that invest a lot in data, and problem to solve still. I don't know if it's been solved. Was it solved after I left at AirBnB, Swaroop, or still a problem today?
I can't imagine any large company solving that.
I got a text message from a software engineer at Airbnb who's like, "I'm still deleting your tables." So I don't know. It hasn't been solved yet.
That was like the downside and the upside, right? I mean, everyone was creating all these things. I mean, there were so many Airflow DAGs, like there were so many creating so much stuff, and some of it was incredibly useful and but also so much of it still exists. So that like governance piece of remembering to delete stuff was probably one of the biggest things that we got wrong. I would agree with that.
I want to add two other things that haven't been mentioned. The first is short-term versus long-term. And Che, obviously really curious to hear your thoughts here, but this is in the same vein as some previous comments, but like I have this blog post where I sort of talk about moving from 100 experiments a week to like 700 or something, right? Obviously very empowering, as Max was suggesting, around data pipelines and things. But I think if we're being fair, certainly my experience on the growth side of things was like, there was a time, and I hope it's changed, but there certainly was a time at Airbnb when it was just like local maxima after local maxima every single week, right? Like there was such an incentive to experiment and, not iterate, but really just like move on to the next win, right? Identify win, move on. I think there are still like tentacles or like implications of this in terms of product, right? Like we historically, at least on the teams that I was on, and I was on both the growth side and the host side of the marketplace, holdouts were rarely done at Airbnb. Search may have been different in Che, marketplace team, love to hear kind of counter examples, but on the growth team, holdouts were like anathema. No one was running holdouts. And man, it was frustrating. It was super frustrating because it always came back down to, well, who's going to maintain, the holdout? And sometimes there were holdouts and they were accidental and they became these like awesome sort of natural experiments, because like so many things trended to zero. So the second thing, which is more organizational, and I can't remember who was still there at this time, but I think it was either Che or Max mentioned, when we were all working together, the data science team was centralized and there was a really strong identity. There was incredible work, right? Like all the projects that we're talking about today came out of this time period where the data team was centralized. And I think it was 2018, 2019, we went through some leadership changes and we used to have a data, a leader pretty high up in the org, and, things got decentralized after that. And the data org has never been the same at Airbnb. If, we're being honest, like thinking about the, whether it's blog posts or projects or just like, the sort of stance of or stature of the team in terms of the Valley, it really changed after that. And, kind of heartbreaking in some ways, but I don't know. I think we had a pretty good thing for whatever reason, shifted, and should be obvious. It still makes me sad.
Well, my theory, it's all about the cookies, right? So they used to bake fresh cookies every day and take them down with a little cart and give, every Airbnb employee who wanted a cookie could get a fresh cookie, freshly baked cookie. And then the moment that stopped, that's where the innovation came to it.
Those almond flour cookies.
Oh my God. I have the recipe somewhere. I asked them
to man.
it out.
Can we publish that with the show notes?
Absolutely.
For me, it was the avocado pudding. I don't know if you guys remember the avocado pudding. I don't even know what avocado pudding is, but it tasted like chocolate pudding.
But what you brought up, Lindsay, on a more serious note, is actually the problem that modern companies face. We might have fantastic tools now, but there is no appetite for strong central teams now. with 25 people. There's just no funding in any company. And that's why, you're seeing business units funding, analyst headcount, data science headcount, machine learning, and the emphasis on data modeling or uniform ways of doing it, that's just going away. I think the central teams are more in the business of spinning up Snowflake, spinning up a bunch of these things, connecting it up, and enabling 50 to 100 stakeholders. And they often don't have the empathy for what is happening day to day with data practitioners. So I think that shift, so centralization to decentralization, is actually a pretty strong one. I don't think as an industry we still have a solve for it.
Like centralized might not be the right word exactly, right? Because it was embedded, but there was like a centralized ethos, right? Of
correct.
Like we're on the data team, we go to the data team meeting, we all, I think that the interesting thing was there were these kind of like more central data teams, right? Or like more central parts of the data org, like the data infrastructure team, for example, where there were data scientists on that team, and their job was to go and talk to all the different data scientists around the company and, bring back all of the different ways that people were doing things, and then say, hey, we need to consolidate this. Like these people are doing this in a really great way. Let's show the rest of the company how to do that. But it wasn't like, oh, I'm a floating data scientist and I happen to be working on search this week because that's the, team that got the prioritization, right? It was this hybrid model that I think was really effective. But I think we lost a lot of that feeling of like, and it was as big as like 70 or 80 people on the team when we would all get together in the same room and, do presentations and like talk to each other about what was going well and what wasn't.
Yeah, it's probably obvious, but like that opportunity, right? Like again, and there were other people like me who didn't come from industry, had no idea what they were doing, right? And I only worked with on the same team as Nick. Like we all met through that centralization, right? Like I was able to approach Che, whose work I had read about or heard about, in knowledge repo, because, it turns out like we're in this meeting together and it's like not as intimidating to be like, hey, Che, like you wrote this really cool knowledge post. I'd love to learn from you, right? I think there's a bigger trend here in terms of like remote work, which I'm largely a fan of, but like, I actually think there are like really important psychological and social functions, right? That bringing people together on a regular basis play that, it wasn't mandated that any of us like hang out together, but it was those kind of opportunities which allowed us to, I think, all learn from each other and then build off of those learnings and connections.
I think that the whole idea of kind of aggregate identity and its impact on the work that people do is probably worthy of its own episode, if not series thereof.
One of the other things kind of on that note that Airbnb got wrong, and I think Lindsay and Swaroop, you both kind of mentioned this a little bit, but at some point we went from, originally everyone was just called data scientist. And I think that was because like, I don't know, who was it, like Bloomberg or something said it was the sexiest job of like 2013 or something like that. And so we were like, oh, okay, the title for everyone who does data is data scientist. I guess data engineers also. But originally the whole kind of data team was data scientists. And then at some point we had this like rubric that said all the different things that you were good at, right? And that was like the way we did performance reviews. And then we started splitting the team into the things that people were really good at. And so we had like analytics, we had like data viz focused people, we had ML focused people, we had inference focused people, and it was in their titles. So the rest of the company would look at them and it would say data scientist inference. And it's like, oh, they must work on experimentation and that's it. You have people joining from PhD programs from, other companies where they're doing some ML and some analytics and some, whatever. And it just kind of boxed them in and said like, hey, this is the job that you do. And so you should spike on this component of this like rubric in your performance review. And that's how you'll, progress as a data scientist, with whatever kind of specialization you're in. And I think that shifting from the generalist mindset to the very specialized one boxed a lot of people in, where you'd have to go through a whole kind of career shift if you wanted to move from, inference to ML. And you'd have to like get manager approval, and a different manager would have to, bring you onto their team. Yeah, that one really, really got me. That was like right when I switched off the data team actually to product. Because I was like, I want to do all this stuff.
Yeah. Conway's law is real. I mean, like how you structure the data org matters a lot. I mean, I have now seen so many data teams that have like analytics under one house and data engineering under another. I feel like it never ends well for a growth stage where you're laying down foundations. Like if you're trying to get an end-to-end data system to work well, you're going to have dependencies all the way upstream to data generation and then all the way downstream to driving a decision.
The biggest challenge with modern data systems is understanding what data you have, where it is located, and who is using it. SelectStar's data discovery platform solves that out of the box with a fully automated catalog that includes lineage from where the data originated all the way to which dashboards rely on it and who is viewing them every day. Just connect it to your DBT, Snowflake, Tableau, Looker, or whatever you're using, and SelectStar will set everything up in just a few hours. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/selectstar today to double the length of your free trial and get a swag package when you convert to a paid plan.
Kind of bringing us towards the end of the conversation, as you look forward from where you are now after spending some time reflecting on where you've been, what are some of the critical lessons that you're focused on relaying to your own teams at the companies that you're building and data teams that you interact with? And what are some of the predictions that you have for the next 5 years of data? Why don't we go around? And so I'll start with you, Swaroop.
Sure. I think I've been saying this throughout the conversation. I think the data practitioners are having to deal with too many things today instead of just getting their main job, which is to deliver business value. They're having to worry about data quality, how to think about cloud cost efficiency, how to think about compliance, standardizing definitions. It's just too much, I think. So this cannot go on with this much fragmentation and not really having that layer, which is not invasive. I think the jury is out now. No one wants kind of intrusive control over everything. It has to sit on top of this and allow all these tools to really interoperate really well. I think that's something that will unlock a lot of value, especially as this decentralization happens. That to me is inevitable. It's going to happen in the next 2 years. Obviously, I have a point of view. I think metadata-driven everything is the way to go here, and metadata-driven orchestration, metadata-driven governance, express governance as code. So people who are doing the work just declare intent and something else takes care of things. So that's one big shift that is happening and will probably bear fruit in the next 2 years or so. Over a slightly longer term, I feel like we still have to navigate the gap between the business terminology and the technical terminology. In the past, when the stack was simpler, you used to build semantic layers to deal with all this. And now I think people have moved away from it, although things like LookML and all those things. And of course, Nick is trying to solve that problem too. But I feel like that layer helping business users really navigate all this complexity. And I think this promise of the semantic layer has been touted for far too long. It's time to deliver on it, I think. Otherwise, I feel like the budgets will actually start shrinking if you don't start delivering on the value. Right now, it's like free for all, lots of promise. But I think in about 3 years of time, if we don't bridge that gap, I think there'll be trouble. So I think a good semantic layer is likely to emerge in the next 3+ years. What that will be exactly, I don't know. But I think a nice translation from that business lingo to the underlying physical stuff is, I think, the other big shift I see happening in the next 3 to 4 years.
I think maybe two of the biggest lessons that I have are, and the first core value at Transform is lead with empathy. And I think that was just something that was really, really kind of just a default at Airbnb. I think almost to a fault at times. Like at times, people struggled to give feedback or criticism because they felt like it wasn't empathetic. And, I think that there's a better way of doing that, right? Like it can be empathetic to give feedback and to kind of try and help somebody grow. But I think that the data team really adopted that at Airbnb. And it was, part of the reason why so many people chose to learn SQL, because they knew that all of the data scientists around them would actually help them to answer the questions that they wanted to ask. So there were, a lot of lessons around, empathy and just generally like Airbnb was an amazing place to work. Like the cookie cart was real. And so I think that's one. And then I think the other one was, as I reflect on all of the different tools that we built, a lot of it was just around kind of pushing accessibility for who gets to kind of do each job down to people who kind of previously were not empowered to do that. And so I think just generally lessons around kind of promoting data accessibility, and that being then the mechanism that led to the rest of the company getting really bought into data. And that, then kind of leading to bigger, better tools and a lot of the kind of things that people have heard about Airbnb's data team now. A lot of that came from investment because business users found the team to be so valuable. And then, I guess following up on the stuff Swaroop was saying, a lot of that is, what I'm trying to bring to transform, and making data accessible, I think, is the core purpose of a semantic layer, mapping the semantics of the underlying data warehouse to something that the rest of the business can understand, I think is, the path to data accessibility. And so that's really what, Metric Flow, the open source project that we're working on, is centered around.
Yeah, to the first question, it's funny, similar to Nick, but one of my favorite core values from Airbnb was be a host. And, be a host literally means opening up your home, but it can also mean, as a data scientist, commenting your code, writing UDFs, turning, things into functions and making them available. And I've kind of changed the wording around a little bit, but it's become a core value at Iggy as well that impacts our product development, in that, the way that we build product is we start from I call it inside out. We start from solving our own problems, and using our own product. And if we're running into problems and our customers are as well, that mentality of being a host and, being empathetic is certainly one I've brought to Iggy and am very proud of. And in terms of, hopefully I'm remembering the question correctly, but, in terms of the future, some stuff that I'm obviously really excited about, not just building product, but in terms of data, a lot of, the tools that we've talked about, a lot of energy over the past, 10 years in data has gone to thinking about data internal to the organization. And, at Airbnb, whether that's logs or experimentation or whatnot, I get really excited about turning outward, right? So again, inside out, not just in terms of how we build our product, but, Iggy, at the end of the day, it's a platform that gives access to various tools and data products. And, those data products allow companies to build better product. And in order to build better product with Iggy, you've got to be thinking about external data. And so there's bigger trends here in terms of open data access, and just so much more data being generated. I'm really excited to see folks, again, leverage it for the products that they're building.
So I think, Tobias, I've been doing prediction on your show for more than 5 years now. So we should go back to my predictions from more than 5 years ago and see how wrong I was. Instead of kind of rehashing the same stuff that I've been hashing and the ideas I've been putting forward, I'll try to go deeper into one that's not necessarily new, but I think that's top of mind for me, is this idea of analytics coming everywhere. I think analytics have been caught in BI tools and into notebooks and into the tools, specialized tools, right? It's a little bit jailed. Analytics are jailed into specialized tools like Tableau and Looker and other tools. And I think we want to see every product become a data product, and analytics kind of, getting out of that jail and becoming more pervasive in the products that we use every day. So we see that already, right? I'm sure Airbnb's got a really good host, listing dashboard they provide to compare you with other listings in your area. I think every single product out there is going to have interactive charts and visualizations and in context where you can take action, right? Analytics are most useful and data is most useful with the context and with the actions that can be triggered from the insights. I think that opens room for beyond, I appreciate we do have embedded analytics, and we have, APIs and things like that to help people kind of reassemble or bring analytics into their applications. There's still a lot of work for everyone to do, so that basically you can get the primitives of a dashboard, of an interactive dashboard with all the cross filtering and the drill down and the drill through type features. So all the powerful features of visual interactive analytics, and make it really easy for people to bring that in the products that they're building. So that's, I think, a trend is to see like the emergence of easy frameworks to do that. And, we're obviously working on this stuff at Preset amongst other things. So it's like unpacking the BI tool into its components so you can kind of build your own, reassemble or remix your own BI tool. Another thing I think we're all invested into is like the unbundling, I think, of BI and the platforms. So historically, I think if you look at the Gartner report for data and business intelligence, historically, the two axes that they put is completeness of vision and ability to execute, as if these two things correlate. The reality is that these things don't correlate. They inversely correlate, right? If you're trying to do everything through a completeness of vision, like Microsoft is trying to do with their BI stack, you're also unable to execute. And I think what we're going to see is unbundling a lot of the data tools, data workflows into an ecosystem, much like we have on the software engineering side of things, where it's accepted that there's a whole set of languages, there's a whole set of tools. We're not trying to find something that's going to solve software engineering. So like the unbundling of that and these kind of pieces of puzzle that fit together. So for Data Hub to work with Superset, for Transform and your semantic layer that work very well with all the BI tools and the next generation BI tools out there, for experimentation to weaved into that ecosystem too. So we're going to see an acceptance of that as these tools can emerge and start playing well together.
All right. And Che, you helped make all of this conversation happen, so I'll let you close this out.
Yeah, definitely. In terms of critical lessons for teams that I've taken internally and externally, I think a big thing for me was Airbnb's emphasis on design and customer empathy. And I think that was, I think we can all agree Airbnb design team is pretty unique in terms of the halo it wields internally and what the product looks like. You can only look at the difference between Airbnb booking to see what that ends up being. And I think there's a lot of that to apply to the data ecosystem. Up until the kind of flourishing of this ecosystem, so many of this stuff was like internal tools built on Tableau or something like that. And it was pretty confusing to navigate unless you were the person who built that tool. And especially for experimentation, which involves this huge leap of faith where you're going to like make pretty consequential decisions and promotions and stuff based upon this opaque black box statistical thing, like design ends up being a big deal. And one of the things Airbnb did really well concurrently with the design was they will always show customer videos in front of the company over and over and over. Like, it used to be like, it's highly produced with like very sappy music and everything. And it was really meant for you to feel the emotions of this product. And so I think there's a lot that I take away from that. Like as a data tools company, it's much harder because not everyone can just become a person running an experiment. Like you can just go travel on Airbnb, but if you can just bring the emotions and build that into like a kind of minimal opinionated design, I think that has a lot of power in data. And then in terms of where stuff's going, like we're all kind of touching on this, that like in the past 5 years, we've seen the foundational parts of data start to consolidate around things like Segment and Snowflake and dbt or whatever. And this means that people higher up on the stack can make a bunch of assumptions around what data teams look like and how they operate. And I kind of see that stuff continuing. I mean, I think we're all probably big believers in semantic layers and kind of what Nick and Transform are doing and what that would unleash. I think working on experimentation, especially, we're all excited for that to continue. And I think what it's going to look like concretely is that these data tasks that are exactly the same every company, these applications, are going to be much better and higher quality and widely used because, you can build better applications when you have stronger foundational assumptions below it. So I see data teams kind of continuing to have consolidation at the foundational level, flourishing at the application level, and then, kind of other exploratory tools in kind of more ad hoc workflows, notebook style, whatever, kind of continuing to grow.
All right. Well, thank you all very much for taking the time today to join me and share your experiences working at Airbnb, the lessons that you've learned there, both positive and negative, and how you're carrying that forward into your own companies and into the ecosystem. So appreciate all the time and energy that you're all putting into helping make data a better place to work. So I hope you each enjoy the rest of your days, and I look forward to speaking to all of you again soon.
Thanks for hosting us.
Yeah. Thanks, Tobias.
Thanks, Tobias.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to check out our other shows, Podcast.init, which covers the Python language, its community, and the innovative ways it is being used, and the Machine Learning Podcast, which helps you go from idea to production with machine learning. Visit the site at dataengineeringpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. And if you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts at dataengineeringpodcast.com with your story. And to help other people find the show, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts and tell your friends and coworkers.